happy Saturday. This week we had an episode on the history of mammography, which did not have many women in it considering its subject matter. So today we have our past episode on Dr. Vera Peters, who really revolutionized the care of two different cancers, one of them being breast cancer, although the medical community's response to her research at the time was pretty skeptical. She started publishing on this work in 1967, so right in the middle of some of what we talked about on this mammography episode.
And near the end of this episode, we mention a paper that cited her male co-author as Doctor, but cited her as Miss, and not being sure whether the paper was published before or after she finished medical school. And we just wanted to note that women with medical degrees or doctorates being called Miss while their male colleagues are called Doctor is not a relic of the past. That still happens today.
Yeah, when I listened to the episode, I was like, we kind of make it sound like this is no longer a problem, but I sure do know many women who are either doctors or have doctoral degrees who are deeply frustrated by it, especially on things like panels and paper titles and etc. This episode originally came out March 18th, 2015, so enjoy.
Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
And I'm Holly Fry.
So we've mentioned quite a number of times that we have an extensively long list of to-dos on the podcast. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of listeners submitted suggestions, and then we have our own to-do lists, and they are both very long. And sometimes, sort of like when you have access to hundreds of channels on the television, it just feels like nothing's on. I scroll through all those things, and there are so many great ideas on there, but none of them are quite catching my attention that day. And you and I both know from experience that the best episodes come from when we're really engaged with what we're talking about.
Yeah, if you're just not in the mood for a topic, even if it's an awesome topic, it just won't turn out as well as if you wait a little while and let it become the thing that catches your mood.
Right. And some of the things I was in the mood to talk about were on hold until stuff could come in from the library. So I was browsing around the internet and found a post on Rejected Princesses about Dr. Vera Peters, who was one of the foremost oncologists in the world in her time. Not only was she one of the only female oncologists in the world, she completely changed the standard of care for two different types of cancer. And she was one of Rejected Princesses' modern worthies, and those are usually about a woman who died within the last 50 years. The Rejected Princesses' Modern Worthies posts tend to be pretty brief, so this one hits the highlights. Dr. Peters helped revolutionize the treatment of both breast cancer and Hodgkin's lymphoma, but at the time that she did, her work was largely ignored and dismissed. So naturally, immediately, I wanted to know a lot more about this person and what she did. Therefore, we're going to have a whole episode on her today.
Hooray! We'll do the usual setup on early life. Mildred Vera Peters was born in Rexdale, Ontario on April 28th of 1911. She was one of 7 children, and her parents were dairy farmers. Her mother was also a teacher. Vera and her siblings worked on the farm starting at a very early age, particularly after the sudden death of their father. Her first education was in a one-room schoolhouse.
She finished high school at 16, and she knew already that she wanted to become a doctor. She was too young to start medical school, though, so she enrolled in the University of Toronto to study math and physics, and then she transferred to the medical program the following year. She worked summer jobs to save up her money, and her brother and her sisters helped pay her way as well.
While she was working as a waitress on a tourist ship, she met Ken Lobb, who was the man she would later marry, and they would eventually have 2 daughters together.
While she was still in medical school, her mother was treated for breast cancer, and after a recurrence, she was treated by Dr. Gordon Richards, who at that point was one of the most respected doctors in the field of radiation oncology, which at that point was pretty early in its development. Dr. Richards was also one of the doctors that Vera studied under, and Vera's mother, unfortunately, did die of her cancer, which was one of the things that led Vera to want to study the disease later in her life.
Dr. Peters graduated from medical school in 1934 and went on to a residency in radiology at Toronto General Hospital. At this point in medicine, there was no official training protocol or certification for radiotherapy. So Dr. Peters apprenticed with Dr. Richards, and she started working at the Ontario Institute of Radiotherapy in 1935. And she continued to work with Dr. Richards right up until his death in January of 1949.
Before we get into more of the specifics of her medical work, here's a caveat. Dr. Peters did really groundbreaking work in the treatment of 2 different cancers, and we're going to talk about them enough to give a sense of why her work was so important. But this is absolutely not meant to be a thorough exploration of either cancer, even of the human body systems that they involved. This is also definitely not a thorough examination of how these cancers are treated today, because the whole field of oncology has evolved tremendously since Dr. Peters retired in 1976. So this is much more about how the developments that Dr. Peters helped launch changed the way medicine was working at the time than about the diseases specifically or how they're treated today.
So Dr. Peters' first groundbreaking work was in the treatment of Hodgkin's disease, which was, before that point, considered to be incurable. Now more commonly known as Hodgkin's lymphoma, this is a cancer that affects the lymphatic system. It's named for Dr. Thomas Hodgkin, who described it in 1832. The major difference between Hodgkin's lymphoma and the more common non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is that Hodgkin's lymphoma involves large abnormal cells called Reed-Sternberg cells, while these cells are not present in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Between its first description in 1832 and 1902, no doctors reported any successful treatment of Hodgkin's lymphoma at all. The first somewhat successful treatment, which was described in 1902, was the use of X-rays on the involved lymph nodes. And while this did shrink the affected nodes somewhat, it didn't cure the disease. It maybe bought people a little time.
There were a few advances between 1902 and 1939 when Dr. René Gilbert of Geneva, Switzerland, described treating the affected lymph nodes with radiation. He treated both the affected lymph nodes and other parts of the body that were not apparently affected. And while some of his patients did improve, many relapsed, and he didn't think of any of them as having been cured.
Dr. Peters' mentor, Dr. Richards, who we mentioned earlier, installed a 400 kilovolt radiation machine at the Ontario Radiotherapy Institute in 1937, just a couple of years before Dr. Gilbert's description of his method. This was a higher voltage machine than what Dr. Gilbert was using, and Dr. Richard used this machine to treat his patients for a variety of cancers.
Dr. Richard's method with Hodgkin's lymphoma was to use extended field radiation on the affected lymph nodes and adjacent nodes. Although some accounts describe this irradiation of nearby nodes as prophylactic, it wasn't really to prevent disease. It was to kill cancerous cells that had already spread to adjacent nodes but weren't yet detectable.
At first, Dr. Peters primarily worked under Dr. Richard's supervision. She was kind of apprenticing to him. But as she became more experienced as a doctor, she began to treat patients on her own as well.
In 1947, after 10 years of treating lymphoma patients with the 400 kilovolt machine, Dr. Richards made an observation to Dr. Peters. It seemed to him that some of their patients were surviving a long time with no relapse, even though Hodgkin's lymphoma was supposedly incurable. And he asked her how she wanted to evaluate their work on the matter.
So there are some people who interpret this as meaning that Dr. Richards should get credit for what happened next. After all, especially at the beginning, he was the one who was successfully treating the patients for their cancer. But what he really did was give Dr. Peters a question to answer. And the work she did to answer that question eventually changed the perception of Hodgkin's lymphoma from being an incurable disease to a curable one.
Dr. Peters spent 2 years studying 113 patients who had been conclusively diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma and treated with radiation at the hospital where she worked. She largely did this by hand at her dining room table.
She was ready to present her findings to her colleagues in 1949, which was unfortunately after Dr. Richards had already died. Her findings revealed, though, that his theory was right. Their patients were living longer than lymphoma patients at other hospitals. Their 5-year survival rate had doubled, and their 10-year survival rate had tripled. Patients in stage 1, which was the least advanced stage, lived a median of 11.6 years. And she didn't describe any of the patients as cured, but their prognosis was really a lot better, and her tone was a lot more optimistic than any of the medical wisdom on Hodgkin's lymphoma at the time.
The idea of approaching Hodgkin's lymphoma with the goal of curing it was revolutionary. And even though Dr. Peters had clear, compelling data to back up what she was saying, it took about 10 years for the medical establishment to start taking this concept seriously.
Dr. Peters presented a follow-up paper in 1956 that included 291 Hodgkin's lymphoma cases, with all of the data just as solidly pointing to the idea that Hodgkin's disease could be cured, especially in the early stages. But perceptions in the medical field didn't really start to change until Eric C. Eason and Marion H. Russell, using Dr. Peters' data, confirmed her work in their paper, Cure of Hodgkin's Disease. That was in 1963. It took even longer than that for the idea that Hodgkin's disease could be approached as something that can be cured in a medical textbook.
Treatments have continued to advance. Today, especially if it's caught in the early stages, Hodgkin's disease is considered to be one of the most curable adult cancers.
Having made these kinds of strides in Hodgkin's disease, Dr. Peters turned her focus to breast cancer, which was personally important to her because of her mother. And we'll talk about that work after a brief ad break. So to get back to Dr. Peters' work with breast cancer, in 1958, the Ontario Cancer Institute at Princess Margaret Hospital opened, and patients and staff from Toronto General, including Dr. Peters and her patients, were transferred there. As a side note, we're about to talk about breast cancer for a while, and while men can and do get breast cancer, we're really going to be talking about women here, because that's the work that Dr. Peters was doing. All of her focus was on breast cancer treatment in women, not in men, so we're not excluding men for some other reason. That's just the work that she was focused on.
So at this point, the overwhelming majority of patients who were diagnosed with breast cancer were treated with a radical mastectomy, also called the Halsted procedure for the doctor who popularized it, almost as soon as they were diagnosed. They would go in for a biopsy, which was done under general anesthesia, and if the lump was cancerous, they'd have the mastectomy before they regained consciousness. This made the possibility of breast cancer particularly terrifying. Women got onto an operating table not knowing if they had cancer or not, and not knowing if they would wake up without a breast or not.
The mastectomy itself, which was the standard treatment regardless of whether the cancer had spread beyond one tumor, was a lot more involved than mastectomies typically are today. A radical mastectomy removes more than just the breast. It also removes the pectoral muscles under the breast, along with the lymph nodes under the arm on the same side as the affected breast. This idea was that the cancer was less likely to spread if you literally removed all of the things adjacent to it where it was most likely to spread. And, while these are the places that cancer is most likely to go after appearing in the breast, this was the course of action regardless of whether cancer had been detected in any of these other places.
Needless to say, a radical mastectomy permanently and significantly altered the body. Even after the reconstruction, a woman's chest itself would look a lot different. It would basically be concave because of the loss of the pectoral muscle wall. Over and over again, modern medical papers describe radical mastectomies of the past as, and this is quote, disfiguring. Such a huge change to such a personal part of the body was psychologically and emotionally damaging for many patients for the rest of their lives.
It could also be physically disabling since it removed some of the muscles used to control a person's arm. And the loss of lymph nodes can lead to permanent swelling and an increased likelihood of infections in the arm. Nerve damage was also a really frequent complication.
And this is why today radical mastectomy is extremely rare, and it's only performed when there really is cancer in those adjacent tissues. When people have mastectomies today, they're usually what's considered a simple mastectomy, which removes the breast but leaves at least some of the lymph nodes, or a modified radical mastectomy, which removes the breast and lymph nodes but only gets into the pectoral muscles if the cancer has actually spread there.
Even though a radical mastectomy was the standard of care for breast cancer patients at this point, There were a few people who didn't have them because of other medical conditions, or in a very limited number of cases, the patients who just put their foot down and refused to have more aggressive surgery. These patients had surgeries that conserved more of their breast. It was either a simple mastectomy or a lumpectomy. Unless there was some medical reason why a woman could not have a radical mastectomy, these options were pretty much always against medical advice.
Dr. Peters' previous work with lymphoma meant she was particularly insightful when it came to how cancer spread through the lymphatic system. Patients were often referred to her for follow-up radiation treatment after their surgery. And she also had personal experience with how traumatic breast cancer treatment could be after she had lost her mother to the disease in 1933. So she wanted to see if less drastic treatments could prove to be as effective as a mastectomy while still preserving as much of the breast as possible.
She published her first work on this subject in 1967, and it was based on comparing the survival rates for women who had been treated for their cancer with different forms of treatment. She studied the record of 7,000 patients who had been treated between 1935 and 1960. 852 of these patients had had their lump removed during their biopsy. 124 of those had radiation as their only follow-up treatment, while the others had some combination of a mastectomy and radiation. What she found was that there was absolutely no difference in the survival time between the women who had just had a lumpectomy and the women who had had a mastectomy.
When it came to women with stage 1 and stage 2 breast cancer, in her opinion, the more conservative surgery, which preserved the woman's breast, was just as viable a medical option as a mastectomy. And this was a completely controversial stance at the time. In her words, quote, "I was refuted and shunned by most of the outstanding surgeons in the States, except for Dr. George Kreil of Cleveland."
She was determined, though, and so she decided to do a case control study of the records from Princess Margaret Hospital. So while she had previously combed through all of the records and looked at them as a whole, this time she controlled for the age of the patients, their other health factors, whether they also had other cancers. She narrowed it down to only patients with stage 1 breast cancer, and then she meticulously matched up the ones who had a lumpectomy and radiation with the ones who had a mastectomy and radiation. And to match them up, she looked at their ages, how large the tumor was, and the year that the treatment took place.
This gave her 145 pairs, in which the lumpectomy group had no statistically significant difference than the mastectomy group. In fact, the lumpectomy group had slightly better survival than the mastectomy group. In other words, for women with stage 1 cancer, a more conservative treatment that preserved their breasts did not harm their chances of survival. Radical mastectomy was not necessary when the disease had not started to spread.
In 1975, she presented these findings at the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada meeting in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Their response was really skeptical at best. 2 years later, Dr. Peters published an updated version of the paper in an international journal, which gave it more exposure and also came to the exact same conclusions. In that paper, she was really direct in her opinion. She said, quote, "As more and more conservative studies ripen, as more and more concerned physicians observe the adverse effects of excessive treatment, as more and more women become armed with knowledge, mastectomy and early breast cancer may become as old-fashioned as bloodletting."
Dr. Peters retired from the hospital the year before that revised paper was published, although she maintained a part-time practice and she continued to teach. But gradually, oncologists did start taking a more conservative approach to early-stage breast cancers. Today, women with early-stage breast cancer generally have a mastectomy if there's some medical reason to do so.
Dr. Peters' impact on the medical field also went beyond just the specific treatment of these two cancers, and we'll talk about how after a brief ad break. So to return to Dr. Peters, a lot of people take the idea of patient-centered care for granted today, even if they've never heard that term specifically. I know that lots of people have lots of different access to medical care depending on all kinds of factors, including their income level and their age and their race and lots of different issues. But for the most part, when people go to the doctor, they kind of expect their doctor to treat them like a human being and to listen to them and to explain what's going on. And this was not really how things worked when Dr. Peters started practicing medicine. She was really a forerunner in the idea of listening to a patient's wishes and explaining to them and helping them make decisions about their own treatment. This whole idea was really far from standard when she was practicing medicine.
Yeah, she actually got to know her patients and she helped them make decisions about their own health care rather than just seeing them as a condition to treat and telling them what to do.
Another common attitude today is that when you go to the doctor, you should get a treatment that's going to be the right amount to solve the problem, not something that's just going to be so completely aggressive that it's going to blast the problem away, but then also leave you with potentially lots of scars or huge side effects or, lots of adverse effects to taking care of the problem. This was also core to Dr. Peters' philosophy as a doctor. She wanted to do the most conservative treatment to get the job done. And it was really different from a lot of what was going on at the time. Obviously, doctors were putting women to sleep to do a biopsy and then taking their entire breast, even in the case of really small tumors that hadn't progressed anywhere. She really wanted to avoid the risks that came of side effects and other complications by doing a more minimal treatment, but still treating the actual problem.
And she was also a role model for young women who were interested in becoming doctors, not just because of her success as a doctor, but also because she proved that a woman could be a doctor while also being a wife and mother. And that was something that really needed proving at this point in history. She did a lot of her research at home. Since she was compiling her work by hand, she wouldn't have been able to make the breakthroughs that she did otherwise. But outside of the medical world, she was Mrs. Lobb, mother of two.
I think a lot of the other female forerunners in the world of medicine that we've talked about have been women who eschewed the more traditional, stereotypical feminine side. And so it actually was a big deal that in addition to being a doctor, she got married and had children. All of this work was additionally incredible because at this point, there were hardly any women doctors at all, let alone women doctors who were on the cutting edge of their field, revolutionizing the treatment of multiple diseases.
And Dr. Vera Peters became an officer of the Order of Canada in 1978. She was awarded the Gold Medal from the American Society of Therapeutic Radiology in 1979 and the Woman of Distinction Award from the Canadian Breast Cancer Foundation in 1988.
Sadly, she died of cancer on October 1st, 1993 at the age of 82. She died at Princess Margaret Hospital in Toronto, where she had worked for most of her career.
And she was inducted into the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame in 2010.
It's kind of a side note. There was a play about her called Radical, which was written by Charles Hayter, who was also an oncologist. That actually premiered to just sell out standing room only crowd at the Toronto Fringe Festival in July 2014.
Thank you, Dr. Vera Peters.
I know. You and I both have family experience with breast cancer, and the fact that somebody said, okay, we have got to just stop treating women as a thing to put on a table and remove part of their body without actually talking to them about it. That's a big deal.
Yeah, the idea of not being asked questions about treatment is so alien to me that it's shocking.
Yeah. I said this to you off mic, and now I'm just going to say it on mic. As I was researching this, I found a citation of that Cure for Hodgkin's disease paper. It was a citation of the paper that was in another journal, and it cited the male doctor as doctor, and the female author of the paper is Miss, and I could not figure out whether she was actually a doctor when that notation was published or not.
Right.
Because it is possible that she was credited on the paper but was not yet a medical doctor. But I sincerely wonder, based on all of the other things that were going on at the time, whether she was just credited as Miss instead of doctor because she was a woman.
Yeah. So that's a mystery that remains to be solved.
Thanks so much for joining us on this Saturday. Since this episode is out of the archive, if you heard an email address or a Facebook URL or something similar over the course of the show, that could be obsolete now. Our current email address is historypodcast@iHeartRadio.com. You can find us all over social media at Missed in History.
And you can subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, the iHeartRadio app, and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.